My daughter-in-law slapped me across the face at my 70th birthday dinner, right there in front of 42 guests. I didn't say a word. I just smiled, walked back to my chair, and finished my soup. 3 days later, I handed her a gift box wrapped in silver paper. She thought it was the deed to my lake house. She tore it open in front of her own mother, laughing about how it was about time the old man came around. Then she saw what was actually inside, and the color drained out of her face so fast, I thought she might faint right there on my dining room floor. Before I tell you the rest, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. And let me know in the comments what city you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I want to know who's listening tonight. My name is Wendell Carmichael. I spent 38 years as a federal prosecutor in the Northern District of Illinois, retired in 2018, and moved back home to Galena to be closer to my grandkids. I was sitting at the head of a long table at the Stone Hearth, a steakhouse on Main Street that's been there since I was a boy, when the slap happened. The chandelier above us was the same one my father had pointed out when he took me there for my high school graduation. I remember thinking, of all the things to notice in that moment, the chandelier was strange. But that's how the mind works when it's protecting itself. It finds something steady to hold on to. The woman who hit me was Cordelia Westwood Carmichael, my son Travis's wife of 6 years. She's 34, a brand consultant with a boutique firm in Lincoln Park, and she had just asked me, in front of everyone, when I was going to stop being selfish and put the family lake house in her and Travis's name. The house was bought by my late wife, Margaret, with money she inherited from her mother in 1991. Margaret passed in the spring of 2022, and the property has been mine alone for almost 4 years. I told Cordelia quietly that the lake house was not going to change hands while I was still drawing breath. I said it the same way I used to tell defense attorneys their motion was denied. No malice, no theater. Just the answer. She stood up. Travis tried to reach for her wrist and missed. She walked the length of the table, and before I understood what was about to happen, her open palm cracked across the left side of my face. The sound was loud enough that the busboy 2 tables away dropped a water pitcher. I felt the heat spread under my eye before I felt the pain. My grandson Cole, who's 9, started to cry. My daughter Hannah half stood, her napkin still in her lap. Travis went pale. Cordelia's mother, a woman named Bernadette, who I'd met exactly twice, said, "Cordy, honey," in a voice that wasn't even particularly shocked, like she'd seen her daughter do worse and was just tired of cleaning it up. I sat down. I picked up my soup spoon. I asked the waitress, very politely, if I could get a fresh napkin. The room was so quiet you could hear the kitchen door swinging on its hinge. That was when I made the decision. Not in anger. In something colder and older than anger. I'd seen 1,000 defendants over the years, and I knew the difference between a person who'd lost their temper and a person who believed, deep in their bones, that the rules didn't apply to them. Cordelia was the second kind. I'd seen it the first time she walked into Margaret's hospital room and started asking about the will, before my wife was even cold. Travis drove her home before dessert. Hannah stayed and helped me to my car. She kept asking if I wanted to go to the urgent care over on Spring Street. I told her I was fine. The bruise would come up in the morning, the way bruises do at 70. I drove myself back to the house on the bluff overlooking the river. The house Margaret and I bought in 1986, and I sat in the front room with the lights off for about an hour. Then I made 3 phone calls. The first was to Otis Hammerschmidt, my attorney for 26 years. Otis is 74, still practicing out of the same office above the hardware store on Bench Street, still answers his cell after 10 p.m., because that's the kind of man he is. I told him what happened. He asked if there were witnesses. I told him 42 of them, including the manager of the Stone Hearth, who I have known since he was in Little League. Otis said, "Wendell, I want you to come in tomorrow morning. Bring everything you've got on the lake house, on Margaret's will, on Travis's finances, and don't say a word to anyone about anything until I see you." The second call was to my old paralegal, a woman named Imogen Petrowski, who retired the same year I did. Imogen has a memory like a steel trap and a Rolodex that connects to half the courthouse staff in 3 states. I asked her if she'd be willing to do a little quiet work for me, off the books, paid in cash and home-cooked meals. She said, "Wendell, I've been bored since 2019. Tell me what you need." The 3rd call was the hardest. I called my son Travis. He didn't pick up. I left a voicemail that said only, "Son, I love you. I need you to come see me tomorrow, alone, before noon. Don't bring her." I didn't sleep much that night. The bruise was already coloring up by midnight, a deep purple shadow under my cheekbone. I stood in the bathroom looking at myself, an old man in a bathrobe with a handprint on his face. And I thought about Margaret. She'd warned me near the end, when the morphine made her honest in a way she wasn't ordinarily. She'd said, "Wendell, that girl is going to hurt our boy, and when she does, you make sure he has somewhere to land." I'd told her she was being unfair, that Cordelia was just ambitious, that I didn't understand modern marriages. Margaret had looked at me with those tired blue eyes and said, "Honey, I prosecuted purchasing contracts for 30 years. I know a grift when I see one." I should have listened. Travis showed up at 10 the next morning. He looked like he hadn't slept either. There was a coffee stain on his shirt cuff. He's 41, an architect with a firm in the West Loop, and he has his mother's eyes, which is sometimes hard to look at. He sat at the kitchen table and put his head in his hands. "Dad," he said, "I'm so sorry. I don't even know what to say." I poured him a cup of coffee. I didn't sit down right away. I leaned against the counter and looked at him for a long time. "Son," I said, "I'm going to ask you a question, and I need you to tell me the truth. Has she ever hit you?" He didn't answer for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "Not on the face." I closed my eyes. He told me things then. Things I wish I hadn't heard but needed to. He told me about the time she threw a wine bottle at him in their kitchen and broke the cabinet door. He told me about how she'd taken his name off the joint account 3 years ago and only put it back on when his salary got deposited. He told me she'd been pressuring him to sign over his share of his late grandmother's beach property in Door County so she could consolidate the family holdings. He told me she kept a folder in her office with our family financials, Margaret's old insurance policies, my pension breakdown, the appraisal on the Galena house, the rental income from the cabin on the Mississippi side. He'd seen it once when he was looking for tax documents. He hadn't asked about it. I asked him why. He said, "Dad, I think she married me because of you, because of who you were in Chicago, because she thought it meant something." I told him I needed him to do something hard. I told him I needed him not to confront her, not to mention this conversation, not to change anything in their household routine. I told him I needed him to trust me for 2 weeks. He looked at me, and I think for the first time since he was a teenager, he saw his father. Not the soft, retired dad who babysat his kids and built tree houses, but the man who used to take down racketeering operations and crooked aldermen. He said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I'm going to do what I should have done the day your mother told me to." Otis Hammerschmidt's office still smells like cigar smoke even though he quit in 1998. I spent 4 hours there that afternoon. We pulled up Margaret's will, the trust she'd set up for the kids, the title to the lake house, the deed to the cabin. We made a plan. The slap had given me something I hadn't had before, which was leverage that could be measured. A bruise. Witnesses. A 911 call I hadn't yet made. Otis said, "Wendell, if you press charges, this becomes a circus." "You sure that's what you want?" I said. "I don't want a circus. I want a record. And I want her to know that the next time she lifts her hand to a member of my family, there's already a file." He understood. He's been my lawyer long enough to know that I don't move without a reason. I made the police report that afternoon at the station on Mika. Officer Donnelly, a woman I'd known since she was a rookie, took the statement. She photographed the bruise, which by then was the color of an old eggplant. She asked if there was a witness who could corroborate. I gave her the name of the Stone Hearth's manager, Vince Castellanos, who I knew would tell the truth because his father had been one of my witnesses in a trucking fraud case in 1994, and I'd treated the family fairly when nobody else would. Vince called me that night. He said, "Wendell, my staff already wrote up incident reports. I made them do it before they left their shifts. I've got 4 servers and a busboy on record. Whatever you need." I thanked him. I told him I'd be in for the ribeye on Friday. Now here's where the story turned, because I'd assumed, sitting in Otis's office, that the slap was the worst of it. That this was a domestic situation with a grasping woman and a son who needed to wake up. I was wrong. The slap was the smallest thing Cordelia had done. Imogen called me on Thursday morning. She said, "Wendell, you'd better sit down." I started pulling on the thread you asked about, and it unraveled the whole sweater. She came over that afternoon with a manila folder. She'd done it the old way. Courthouse records, public filings, a couple of phone calls to former colleagues. What she'd found was this. In 2021, while Margaret was dying, Cordelia had convinced my wife to sign a power of attorney for medical decisions. That much I knew. What I didn't know was that, 16 days before Margaret passed, Cordelia had also brought a notary to the hospice and had Margaret sign a financial power of attorney. The signature was real. Margaret's hand was guided by someone else's. You could see it in the wobble, but the signature was technically hers. And in the 2 weeks between that signing and Margaret's death, Cordelia had moved $47,000 out of an investment account my wife had kept separate from our joint finances. The account was in Margaret's name only. It was money she'd been saving for the grandchildren's education. Imogen laid out the transfers. The money had gone to an LLC called Westwood Brand Strategies, which was Cordelia's consulting firm. The firm had then paid down a line of credit. There was nothing to recover. The money was gone, spent on rent and salaries and a Mercedes lease for Cordelia's business Image. I sat at my kitchen table and I cried. Not the loud kind. The kind that just leaks out of an old man's eyes while he stares at a wall. Margaret had spent her last lucid days worrying about whether the grandkids would be able to afford college, and her daughter-in-law had walked into the hospice with a notary and taken it. Imogen let me cry. She worked with me long enough to know that sometimes you need a minute. Then she said, "Wendell, there's more." I checked her firm. It's a shell. 3 of her 4 clients are paper companies registered to her cousin. The real money coming through that LLC is from somewhere else, and I think we both know where to look. I called Travis again. I asked him, very gently, if he had ever co-signed anything for Cordelia. He went quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Dad, I co-signed a business loan 4 years ago, for $270,000. She told me it was paid off in 2023. I asked him to check. He called me back an hour later. The loan was still active. There were 3 missed payments. His credit score, which had been in the 800s when he and Cordelia got married, was now in the low 600s. He hadn't noticed because she'd had the mail rerouted to a P.O. box. I told my son to come stay at my house. Just for a few days. Bring the kids if he could. Tell her his father was sick and needed help. I told him not to tell her anything else. He said he'd do it. The next person who entered the story was a man I hadn't expected. His name was Russell Pendergast. He called me out of the blue on Saturday morning. He'd gotten my number from a mutual acquaintance at the Galena Country Club. He said, "Mr. Carmichael, I understand you might be looking into Cordelia Westwood. I was married to her from 2014 to 2017. I think we should talk." I met Russell at the diner on Highway 20. He was 51, sober, 8 years, recently remarried, lived now in Davenport. He told me what Cordelia had done to him. The pattern was identical. She'd married him while he was still mourning his first wife, who died of breast cancer. She'd gotten access to his accounts within 4 months. She'd convinced him to refinance his house. By the time he filed for divorce, his credit was destroyed, his retirement was halved, and his adult daughter wasn't speaking to him because Cordelia had spent 2 years convincing him his daughter was after his money. He said, "She came after me physically too. Twice, once with a kitchen drawer. I have the dental records. I never pressed charges because I was ashamed. I asked him if he'd be willing to make a statement now. He said, "Mr. Moy, Carmichael, I've been waiting 8 years for somebody to ask me that." By Sunday, I had 3 more names. Imogen had pulled marriage and divorce records from 3 counties. There was Russell, there was a man in Rockford who'd been engaged to Cordelia briefly in 2013, and there was a woman, a business partner from her first consulting firm in 2018, who'd been bought out of her own company under duress. Imogen found her in a suburb of Madison. Her name was Constance Yoder, and when I called her, she wept on the phone for 10 minutes before she could speak. Constance had something Russell didn't. She had emails. 3 years of them. Documenting financial misconduct, intimidation, the systematic isolation of her from clients and family. She'd kept them because her therapist had told her to. She'd never shown them to anyone. I asked her if I could see them. She drove down to Galena on Monday morning. By Monday afternoon, I had a folder on my dining room table that was 4 inches thick. Russell's statement, dental records, divorce filing, Constance's emails, the buyout agreement, the forensic accountant's report she'd commissioned but never used, Imogen's research on the LLC, Travis's loan documents, the transfers from Margaret's account, the police report from the Stone Hearth, the witness statements from Vince's staff. I called Otis. I asked him to come over. He arrived in 20 minutes with a yellow legal pad and a thermos of coffee. He read everything. When he was done, he took off his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose and said, "Wendell, this isn't a domestic case. This is a pattern. This is what we used to call, in your line of work, a target-rich environment." I said, "Otis, I want to do this right. I don't want revenge. I want a record. I want every person she's done this to, and every person she's going to do it to be able to look up her name and see the truth, and I want my son free of her without losing his children." Otis nodded. He said, "Then we don't go to civil court first. We go to the state's attorney. We hand them the financial elder abuse case for Margaret. We let them run with it. The rest of it follows." That's what we did. I'm going to skip ahead a little because the legal piece took months, and what matters more is what happened in my own house. The Tuesday after Otis and I talked, I invited Cordelia over for what I told her was a family conversation about the lake house. I said I'd been thinking about her proposal. I said I was open to discussing it. She came over that evening in a cream-colored blazer with her hair done. She brought a bottle of wine I didn't open. Travis was in the kitchen. Hannah was in the den. Otis was in the front room with a stenographer he'd hired for the afternoon. None of them came out yet. I sat Cordelia down at the dining room table. I had the silver-wrapped gift box on the sideboard. I'd put it there that morning. I told her on the phone it was a peace offering. I told her I had been doing some thinking. I told her I understood she had ambitions, and that I respected ambition. I told her I'd prepared a gift that I hoped would reflect a new chapter in our relationship. Her eyes lit up when she saw the box. She actually said, out loud, "Wendell, you didn't have to." I told her to open it. She did. She lifted the lid. Inside was an envelope, and inside was an envelope with 3 documents. The first was a certified copy of the financial power of attorney she'd had Margaret sign at the hospice, with a sticky note from a handwriting expert flagging 2 letters in the signature as inconsistent with my wife's known handwriting under medication. The second was a printout of the wire transfers from Margaret's account to Westwood Brand Strategies, dated and time-stamped. The third was a single sheet of cream-colored paper with the seal of the Joe Davies County State's Attorney's Office at the top, formally notifying Cordelia Westwood Carmichael that she was a person of interest in an open investigation into financial elder abuse, exploitation of a vulnerable adult, and conspiracy to defraud. She read the first document. Her hand started shaking. She read the second. She made a sound I'd only heard a few times in my career, a sound that comes out of a person when they realize, all at once, that everything is about to be different. She read the third, and her face went the color of the napkin in front of her. She looked up at me. I said, "I have a 4th document. It's a draft civil complaint on behalf of Russell Pendergast, Constance Yoder, and a Mrs. Adelaide Honeycutt of Rockford, regarding a pattern of financial coercion, We'll be filing it in 3 weeks unless you and I reach an understanding before then." She tried to speak. She tried twice. The third time, she said, "Wendell, please. We can work this out. We're family." I told her that family was exactly what we were going to talk about. I told her that she was going to consent to an uncontested divorce from my son. I told her she was going to sign away any claim to his premarital assets, the Door County property, and any future inheritance from me or my estate. I told her she was going to enter a payment plan to be supervised by Otis Hammerschmidt, returning the $47,000 to a restored trust for my grandchildren, with interest at the federal rate. I told her she would have supervised visitation only with my grandson and granddaughter, on terms my son and his attorney would set. I told her, finally, that if she agreed to all of this in writing, the civil complaint would remain a draft. I told her the criminal investigation was no longer in my hands. That horse had left the barn. She asked, in a voice that was barely a voice, what would happen if she didn't agree. I told her the truth. I told her that the criminal case was going to proceed regardless. I told her that the civil complaint would be filed, joined by other plaintiffs, and that it would be reported on, because I had already spoken to a friend of mine at the Tribune. I told her that her firm would not survive it. I told her that everyone she had ever charmed would know exactly who she was. I told her that what I was offering her was not mercy. I was past mercy. What I was offering her was the chance to walk out of my family with her freedom, for as long as the state's attorney allowed her to keep it. Otis came out of the front room. He had the agreements ready. He told her she had the right to consult independent counsel before signing. She just stared at the table. She signed. She signed the divorce papers. She signed the asset waiver. She signed the restitution agreement. She signed an acknowledgement that she had received a notice of the open investigation. The stenographer recorded everything. Travis came in at the end. He didn't say anything. He just stood in the doorway with his arms folded. He looked at her once, and then he looked away, and I knew, watching him, that something in him had finished. Cordelia left through the front door without her wine bottle. I never saw her in my house again. The criminal case took 14 months. She pleaded out in the end to a single felony count of exploitation of an elderly person. She got 2 years probation, a felony on her record, and a restitution order that locked her income for a decade. Her firm dissolved. The Tribune did run a piece, though it focused mostly on elder financial abuse as a category and used her case as one of several examples. Russell Pendergast called me the day it ran. He said it was the first time in 8 years he'd been able to read his own name in a story about her and feel anything other than shame. He said his daughter had called him that morning. They were going to have lunch. Constance Yoder sent me a card at Christmas. She'd opened a new consulting firm under her own name. She wrote, in handwriting that looked steady, that she'd hired 2 women in their 50s who were starting over after divorces. She said she thought of me and my wife often. Travis moved in with me for almost a year. The kids loved it. Cole learned to fish off the dock at the lake house. My granddaughter Wren, who's 6, drew a picture of the 4 of us, me, her dad, her and her brother, standing on the bluff over the river, and I had it framed. It's hanging in the front room next to a photo of Margaret. The trust for the grandchildren was restored. The first tuition payment for Cole's college fund comes due in 9 years. There's enough in there now to cover it twice over. Because once people in town heard what had happened, 3 of my old friends from the country club asked if they could contribute. I said no, the first time. The second time, I said yes. I want to tell you that I feel good about what I did. I want to tell you that I sleep easy. The truth is more complicated. I sit on my porch some evenings looking out over the river, and I think about Margaret. I think about how she warned me, and how I dismissed her, and how she died believing the grandchildren's college money was safe. I think about my son, and the things he endured for 6 years that he never told me, because he was ashamed, and because I was the kind of father he didn't think he could come to with that kind of pain. That's on me. That's a thing I'll carry. But here's what I learned, sitting in that dining room watching Cordelia sign those papers. There is a difference between revenge and a reckoning. Revenge is loud, and it costs you something every time you serve it. A reckoning is quiet. A reckoning is what happens when a person who has been hurting people for a long time finally meets a record that is older and more patient than her charm. I didn't slap her back. I never raised my voice. I gathered names and dates and signatures and witnesses the way I used to do for a living. And then I put it all in a silver box and I let her open it herself. If you're watching this and you're an older person, and someone in your life has been treating you like an obstacle between them and your money, I want you to hear me. You are not obligated to keep the peace by giving them what they want. You are not obligated to protect them from the truth of what they have done. Your dignity is the last thing you own, and no one can take it from you unless you hand it to them in a silver box yourself. Hannah came over last Sunday for dinner. Travis brought the kids. We ate pot roast on Margaret's good plates, the ones Cordelia used to ask about. Cole told me a long story about a fish that he claims weighed 11 pounds. I think it was probably 4. Wren fell asleep on the couch holding my hand. The lake house is in a trust now, jointly for both my kids with provisions for the grandchildren. The deed is in a safe deposit box at the First Bank of Galena, and Otis has the key. If this story meant something to you, do me a favor and hit the like button, and leave a comment telling me about a time you stood your ground when it would have been easier to stay quiet. I read everyone, and if you want to hear the next story, there's a video waiting in the box at the corner of your screen. Pour yourself a cup of coffee and stay a while. We've got plenty more to talk about. I've been turning this over in my head for a long time now, sitting on that porch with a cup of coffee getting cold in my hand, and what I keep coming back to is that nothing Cordelia did to my family happened by accident. Every step of it followed from the one before. My wife Margaret saw her clearly the first week she walked into our lives, and Margaret told me, and I chose not to hear it. That choice had a cost. The cost was $47,000 taken from our grandchildren, 6 years of bruises on my son Travis that he hid from me out of shame, and a slap across my face in a public restaurant that I'll feel under my cheekbone on cold mornings for the rest of my life. Cause and effect. There is no mystery about it. I think a lot of people my age were raised to believe that keeping the peace inside a family is the highest form of love. I was raised that way. My own father swallowed things from his brother for 40 years that should have ended that relationship in 1962. He carried the resentment of it to his grave. What I've come to understand, sitting here at 70 with a felony conviction now attached to a woman I once called my daughter-in-law, is that silence is not peace. Silence is just permission. Dressed up in nicer clothes, every time a person like Cordelia gets away with something small, she learns that the next thing she tries can be a little larger. The hand that takes $47,000 from a dying woman is the same hand that slaps an old man at his birthday dinner. It's all the same hand. 3 things kept me steady through all of this, and I want to name them because I think they're worth more than any inheritance I'll leave behind. The first is character. You build it slowly, in private, over decades by doing the small right thing when nobody's watching, and you draw on it suddenly, in public, when everything is. I had 38 years of habit telling me to gather evidence instead of throwing punches. That habit saved my son. The second is judgment. The willingness to look at a person clearly, even when she's married to your child, even when looking clearly, might cost you the grandchildren you adore. I failed that test for 6 years. I won't fail it again. The third is endurance. Not the loud, jaw-set kind, the quiet kind. The kind that lets a man sit at a dining room table for 14 months of legal proceedings without ever once raising his voice, because he knows the record he's building is more permanent than the bruise on his face. If you take one thing from what I've told you tonight, let it be this. The people who hurt you are counting on your shame to keep you quiet. They are counting on your love for the ones around them to keep you compliant. They are not counting on you to be patient, exact, and unembarrassed about telling the truth, be the thing they didn't plan for. That's not revenge. That's just becoming the kind of person you were always meant to be, a little later than you should have.